Okay, my name is Annabelle Gottlieb. I use she, her pronouns. I take verbal POIs, and I'll be speaking first for the government.
My name is Ethan Bordoff, he, him pronouns, verbal POIs, second for the government.
My name is Michelle Grinberg. I'll be the first speaker for opposition, she, her pronouns.
My name is Adisendra. I'll be the second op speaker. Any pronouns are fine. Also, this is our fourth time being op. We have not done gov at all at this tournament.
Crazy. Okay, just one thing before I get into case, I'd like to give a quick trigger warning. We're gonna be talking about suicidality and like mental health, but not in like a graphic way. If anyone has an issue with that, you can like privately chat us or anything, and we just won't say it. I'll just wait a little bit if anyone wants to. If not, we'll get started. Okay, I think that's probably enough time. If anyone wants to privately chat, it's not going to be until like a little bit later in the speech, so we'll still be able to see it. But yeah, otherwise I can start my speech. Okay, time begins now. So first I'm just going to do some top of case, defining this house, framework, and a couple overviews. So we're just going to find this house as a rational actor because there's no actor specified, and you should always default to a rational actor to decide what's best for the world. And with that, our framework is utilitarianism because this encompasses the entire world. It's encompassing everyone. It's the only framework with objective evaluation and justification of actions, so we should default to it. And when deciding about a huge group of people, the only way to make any decisions is to consider the effects on everyone and the specific magnitude of those effects. So just to go into a quick characterization of a world without sadness. So anyone would be able to feel any other emotion like anxiety or joy or regret, but you're not always happy. You are just never actively sad. And sad is kind of taken out of that like cocktail of negative emotions you feel whenever something happens. And so our first overview here is that emotional reactions very rarely involve just sadness. There is no emotional reaction that involves just one emotion. Our first one here is that like emotional reaction, think about the way you respond if anything negative happens to you. Like if you get broken up with, a classic example of like when you might feel sad, yeah, you're going to feel sadness, but you're also going to feel regret, you're going to feel pain, you may feel anger or anxiety or shame. There are always other emotions that go along with sadness. So there's almost no reaction that is purely sad. And our second overview here is that sadness is the longest lasting emotion, and it often lingers after many others. Other emotions like anxiety or anger are more short term, and people are more likely to get over them more quickly. Also, when a negative emotion is removed from this kind of mix of negative emotions you feel, it makes it easier to overcome the negative emotions, but it does not erase the lessons learned from them or the fact that it's kind of a deterrent for that happening again. So our first contention is mental health. Check that real quickly. Okay. The first subpoint is on suicidality. One of the biggest causes of suicidality is sadness and depression, which is an outsized reaction to sadness, like a mental health diagnosis. Yet again, when you take away negative emotion from this kind of mix of negative emotions that often people with mental illnesses kind of feel things more strongly, it allows people to recover from these spots that are really dark, and when you're feeling terrible about yourself and feeling like you might want to die by suicide, and it makes it easier to recover from these negative emotions much more quickly. When people can get out of these moments more easily, when these emotional reactions they're having aren't as large or aren't as impactful or don't take over their entire mindset so much, they're less likely to die by suicide. And obviously the impact here is death. We're just going to experience fewer deaths from this when sadness doesn't exist in the world. Our second contention is on hope. When you cannot feel sadness, you are much more likely to bounce back from failure super quickly. Even if you feel shame or regret, you can get over those more quickly than the sadness any failure brought. When a negative emotion is removed from the mix, yet again, you'll overcome it quickly. So the first subpoint here is on personal matters. When one feels sad after a personal failure, like rejection or getting fired from a job, you'll be more likely to bounce back when there isn't sadness in that mix. You will learn from the mistake, yes, but you will overcome the emotions faster and recover. This is better for the world because it makes people less hung up in terms of relationships. They won't have to be as worried about failure if they know the failure is not as bad or won't linger as long. So it means people could pursue more relationships, friendships, stuff like that. People will be less scared of kind of pursuing things for their own personal gain, which obviously will lead to better relationships and just a better world, because when we have more relationships and we're all there to support each other, it creates a better world. Our second subpoint is on innovation. People are more likely to persevere when they're not sad that something failed yet again, and people don't like the idea. People don't want to try the same thing again because it could fail and because they might be dreading the sadness, because sadness is yet again the most long-term emotion. It also means that if they're feeling that sadness about it, it's going to take longer to kind of restart projects or things that you may be super personally invested in. And so the impact here is on increased innovation. When you can bounce back from this failure quickly, people are more likely to pursue more projects, even if the last one they had failed. They're more likely to keep trying. Imagine if Edison didn't keep trying to invent the light bulb. So the impacts of increased innovation are like climate change technology and green tech, which can help.
Point of information.
Can I take it at the end of my speech if I have time? Sorry, I just have a lot to get through. So the first impact here on increased innovation is like green tech and helping solve solve climate change. The second impact is on helping the economy because increased innovation leads to a more productive economy. And the third is that can help many people in developing nations through technology like medical access, through climate change technology, everything like that. So our third contention is on structural violence as a principle. The principle here is helping the victims of structural violence the most. And what it means is that we're focusing on helping the victims of structural violence the most. So why we meet is two key ways. The first is mental health equality. As we've already talked about, having less sadness in the world is going to help people's mental health on the whole. Obviously, mental health services, specifically relating to affording medication or therapy, or even just having access to knowing that those things exist and can be helpful, is way more readily available to those who are wealthier. It is just something that like people in developing nations or even people in developed nations who don't have that much money or who are impoverished cannot access. Due to structural violence, marginalized groups historically have lower income and are not able to afford these services, which creates a spectrum of happiness along economic lines. It makes it much harder to access mental health services for people who have been historically marginalized. The second issue is on developing nations. Developing nations are often overlooked in policymaking and sidelined in bigger decisions, restricting the access of those within to basic needs. Sadness, in addition to pain due to this comparison, exists for marginalized people in developing nations. However, you can cross-apply our warranting from our last contention to see that people in developing nations have more hope of improving their standings, economic situations, and country as a whole. When people give up hope, the same cycle persists. However, when there's more hope in the world, when there's less sadness, these people will be able to, yet again, kind of recover quickly from bad things, be able to maybe even start movements that fail. There will be more perseverance. They don't meet for a key reason. By allowing sadness to persist when marginalized groups are forced to feel more sadness on net, they're failing to help these groups. Why this should be considered as a priority? This should be considered as a priority because most policymaking and global decisions overlook these groups. And under utilitarianism, we have to be helping these people the most, and getting rid of their sadness will help the most. Whoever helps those of lower income or marginalized people wins this principle. Okay, our fourth contention is on happiness, and this is another principle argument. So the principle here is upholding happiness, and what it is just to maximize happiness on net. We uphold this by eliminating sadness inherently, which, yet again, as we tell you, kind of decreases this mix of negative emotions, and it leads to happiness being more effective. Why they don't uphold, because inherently everything they do would only decrease happiness if you could feel sadness. Nothing they could talk about increases the ceiling for how happy people can be. And on net, if everyone is to some degree happy, we'd say average happiness still goes up, given that in the world, a lot of people are sad right now. Why this matters the most is that ultimately happiness is utilitarianism and more. It solves for the problems. You're sad when harm is done, but also when your shoe is stolen to be given to someone who it fits better. It's all about happiness. When there is no sadness, negative emotions wear off much more quickly, and happiness will overcome other emotions quicker. Thus, we urge a Gov ballot.
Okay, great speech. Let me just get my time. Is everyone ready? I don't think side government has a full understanding of how happiness actually interacts with sadness and what emotions are likely to look like in Gov world. I'm going to start with some framing, 3 contentions on op, and then I'll get into some response side government. Let's start with this emotion. We broadly agree with the definitions. We think that other emotions aside from sadness exist. We don't think that there's other negative emotions. We think fear exists. We think anger exists. However, we think a lot of the emotions they name that still exist are sadness. We think when you break up with, we think when the relationship ends and you feel regret because you feel sad that you won't have more of a relationship, that you won't have more experiences with your partner. We think a lot of the things they say kind of do branch into sadness, but we do think there's distinct negative emotions that exist. But we also think that negative emotions are really tied to positive emotions. We'll get into that more on our case. I think that's it for top of case. First contention is on how there's less happiness, which is a direct clash with our contention. We think diminishing returns exist in the same way that if you give a billionaire a dollar, they're not actually going to experience anything because they have billions of dollars. If you give a homeless person a dollar, they obviously feel happy because they don't have any money. It's the same way. If no one is ever sad, they're always at a baseline level of happiness, which means they're never going to get any more happy because they're at this constant level of happiness. We think the reason people feel happy in general is because they can appreciate the little.
Eli,
Yeah.
so you're saying that nobody can ever become more happy than they are at any given moment?
That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that the reason why people feel happy, broadly speaking, is because they know that experiences don't last forever. Because they know that there's going to be points in the future where, like, you're not going to be as happy as you are right now. We think it's part of the reason why vacation is so fun, because it's not your current, and that's not your life that you live every single day. Because it's a temporary experience, because you get to enjoy it while it lasts. We think that you're always at the same level of happiness, pretty much, because you're never sad, you never feel dips, you never feel downwards in like your cycle of happiness. We think that you're always just the same amount of happy, which means that happiness doesn't feel as good. You never feel as, it doesn't feel like you're actually as happy as you are, because you're always the same level of happiness, maybe getting slightly happier in certain days. Okay. Our second contention is going to be on societal implications. Firstly, on incentives. We think that a lot of the reason why people innovate, why people do the things they do, is because of sadness. We think, for example, if someone's parent passes from cancer, they're going to work really hard to make a cancer drug. We don't think that innovation just happens like they describe without emotion. We think some of the best innovations, some of the best social movements, some of the best things that we have in our world are based off of deep emotion. Someone feels really sad because they look at the world today, they don't like how something happens, they try to fix it, they work really hard to fix it. We're probably going to have more innovation on our side. Secondly, is on detachment from emotion. We think when people are less attached from emotion, they're probably going to commit more crime. They're probably going to be less empathetic to other people. We think that one of the key tenets of humanity is being able to see other people, see their struggles, actually resonate with their struggles, because you remember being as sad as they are. If you can't feel any sadness, you can't empathize in this way, which means you're not going to do a lot to help them. You're not going to do a lot to try to fix this. Okay, next is art. We think that a lot of art is fundamentally tied to sadness. People put in their personal experiences, their sadness, their lived experiences. They then make really good artwork. They make songs, they make art, they make music in general. We think this is really good. We think other people see this, they relate. We think a lot of the deepest human emotions are based off this mutual understanding of sadness. We think this all goes away and society gets a lot less complex in their side of the house when it's just kind of no one can ever feel sad. No one really understands the full reach of human emotion. It's just kind of everyone's baseline happy all the time. On dealing with trauma, we think that the grieving process gets weirder on their side of the house, because you can't feel sadness, but I think they can see that you still feel negative emotion, which leaves us in a really weird place, because now you feel really sad. So where does that sadness go? We tell you it goes towards anger. We tell you it goes towards numbness. We tell you can no longer cope in healthy ways, because feeling sad is healthy. When you can no longer feel sad and bad things happen to you, you still have to feel something. Otherwise, you just feel numb. So you default to anger. You default to other emotions, which are probably also really bad. We think a really, really large reason why the male suicide rate is a lot higher than females is because men are told not to be sad, because they're told that that's not an appropriate masculine emotion. Thus, they default to anger, which is considered more socially appropriate for men. Then they go out and commit violent crime. We think this happens on their side of the house on a higher, we think that there's large, that's part of the reason why men commit more crime than women. We think in general, when people can't feel sadness, it transfers to other emotions, which are probably displayed in worse ways. Okay, let's go inside Gov's case. What do they tell you? Their C1 is on mental health. First, we think, cross-apply my analysis about diminishing returns. We think the baseline level of happy feels less happy after a while. If you can't feel sadness to balance out the high happiness, you're probably always just going to feel this baseline level of happy. We think it's probably not going to be good for mental health for everyone. We think that if everyone is less happy on net and everyone's sadder, it probably isn't going to be yeah, sure, maybe I think it's probably going to be a lot worse. Okay, then we also tell you that people who are depressed in their world probably still feel sad, or probably still feel emotion in our world. We tell you that sadness is just going to be transferred to anger, to fear, cross-apply that response. On C2 about hope, we think that on our side of the house, you're still going to have you're still going to innovate. We think we can turn the whole innovation hope thing to our side, because we think a lot of hope is fundamentally rooted in acknowledging that problems happen in the first place and being really affected by problems. We think that when you're living in a world and you feel really sad because you see that things are messed up, you're going to be a lot more personally invested in fixing it than if you're just don't feel sad, don't feel empathetic for other people. On innovation, cross-apply our innovation impacts. I respond to this on our case. Then Oh, then I think they give you this point about how you need to be able to bounce back from failure. I think if they're telling you that you can't feel shame, you can't feel sad after failure at all, you're just going to keep trying. I think reckless failure probably kills careers. It gets publicized. You get other grants and like funding cut. That's probably not a good thing. Then they tell you structural violence. I'm not sure if they mean this in a principled way or if they're just saying that like we should try to help people who are who are victims of structural violence, because the framework is util, so I'm not really sure if this is meant in a principled sense. But cross-apply all of our like happiness analysis about how we think we get less net happiness in their world. Then on mental health equality, I don't think the solution to mental health is to prefer a world where people don't experience the most fundamental emotion to our ability to learn, to grow. We think that like in their side of the house, people can't actually heal from trauma because they can't feel their trauma in the very first place. On developing nations, cross-apply a lot of our other analysis about happiness. Then they give you the C4 about how there's just going to be more net happiness because no one can feel sad. We tell you this isn't true. We tell you that like counterintuitively there is less happiness on their side. The reason we feel happy is because we're also able to feel sad because we like acknowledge the contrast between happiness and sadness. On their side of the house, if you're just constantly feeling no sadness, you're feeling one baseline level of happiness, it's kind of unclear how you're actually going to have more happiness. We think you'll probably experience more numbness. We think you'll probably experience more anger. That's probably going to be a really bad thing. So proud of Tuba Peppers.
Time is starting. Okay, so first off, I'm going to go over some top of case and big clashes that apply to the whole round. Then I'll go over what they said to our case and then their case. So first off, they say that for like they agree with their definitions, but say that like regret is sadness. Most of the emotions we talk about are sadness. Okay, we can concede like sure, maybe regret is sadness, but we'd say there are still a lot of other emotions that still exist, like anxiety, like anger, etc. Right? If anything, regret's just another long-term emotion that we're eliminating, right? But you still have all those things. Then they say that negative emotions are tied to positive emotions, and I'd probably say this is the largest clash in the whole round because basically the only way that they respond to any of our principled arguments and any of our largest things, they just blatantly say that there is going to be less happiness in the world on net. Now, this is going to be untrue for a couple of reasons. First off, something that they keep saying is that you are going to feel one baseline level of happiness and you are not going to be able to feel more or less happy, and thus you won't be able to be excited for anything. We'd say this is completely untrue. If you're like right now sitting at home on your phone, right, you're not happy, you're kind of just neutral. But if you heard that you could go to Disneyland, it's not like you would feel the same emotion even if you couldn't be sad. If you eliminate sadness, if you think about all the times when you've either been a little bit of happy and then became a lot of happy, or like not happy at all and then became happy, it's not like nothing changed for you because you weren't going from sad to happy. You can always go from happy to happier. You can always go from neutral to happier. They provide zero warranty for why this is true. But then, even if you believe everything they say about how it's all going to fade, we'd say it could, even if it does fade, like the maximum it's going to fade is kind of just a little, and that it would have to be true that on net, right, average happiness in the world is positive right now. For when you eliminate sadness, the average to be higher. And we'd say the average happiness in the world is not zero. We'd say it's probably negative. If you look at the world at large, not just the US, but the world at large, we would say probably there are more times when people are sad, where on average, people are more sad than they are happy. And that means that basically, if you eliminate all sadness, you bring the average over, which means literally it is impossible for them to access these impacts because we're bringing it to zero, they're below zero. We ultimately have more happiness on net. So moving on to what they said to our contention. So first off, they tried to say that like they're diminishing returns on like mental health because you have this baseline level of happiness. First off, this just isn't true. You're still going to be, you still can be even happier. It's just like you don't have to get therapy if you're neutral and then become happy versus if you're depressed and then become happy, right? It's still just eliminating all the things. Then they say that people who are depressed feel other emotions. We'd say like, sure, they experience other emotions, but depression is one of the most persistent. As we said, they didn't really contest or warranting that happiness or that sadness lasts way longer than all the other emotions, which means it's going to last for a lot longer and be a lot harder to deal with. They also didn't say, I mean, the only reason why they said these other emotions were bad is that like anger leads to violent crime, and that's basically the only reason why it would be bad to feel other emotions. We'd say it's not true that everybody who's angry goes to violent crimes, but then just another thing they say, and I'll get to this more in their case, but it's not true that if you just stop feeling sadness, you won't feel you'll just transfer into other emotions. And the reason for that is because they keep trying to say, right, that everything will flatten out because like there will be less net happiness over time because base level of happiness is now what sad was, right? So if you can return to that base level of happiness, and that's like what sad is, so everything feels like a little bit more sad, then you can still inherently have what they call sadness. It's not like it has to be transferred, because if your happiness can decrease, if on net happiness is decreasing, then you can transfer the sadness into just decreased happiness instead of like other emotions. It's not like it has to go all the way back down. I know this sounds very confusing. I'm sorry for that. But I'll get to that more on their case. I still have a little more time. So on contention 2 of hope, they say you still have innovation. We'd say like they say people are not going to acknowledge that problems happen because they can't feel the pain. We'd say people will still acknowledge that problems happen in the first place. Then they can't say that, they say you can't feel empathy, right? We'd say the definition of empathy is literally like feeling the emotions of other people, right? So if you can feel all other emotions but sadness and nobody feels sadness, then you can clearly feel every other emotion that somebody else would have, right? It's only if somebody else could have an emotion that you can't have that you can't feel empathy. So as long as you still have the emotion that they have, you are feeling empathy to the same degree. Yeah.
So people just like won't be sad about their oppression or comprehend their oppression or feel empathy for people being oppressed?
They would not feel the emotion of sadness. I would be angry if I was oppressed, right? I would want to fight that oppression, but I wouldn't just be like totally sad about it. I would be able to put that anger to a better use because I would feel angry that someone is oppressing me, right? And by your logic, right, you're putting this all into anger, right? So then on our last contention, they say less net happiness. I think I've gone over this, but I can go over it more when I get to their case. Then they just cross out happiness to our contention 4 of happiness. On framework. So before going into specifics, we'd like to point out something they didn't clarify. They say that sadness will turn into other emotions, but then like, how is happiness decreased? This, I guess, is what I was trying to say before, right? But like the argument relies on the idea that you feel less negative on the whole, right? You need to decide one. If you transfer to other emotions, then their arguments on empathy and less happiness don't stand. If you don't transfer to other emotions, then their impacts of violence and dealing with someone's trauma don't stand, right? So we have access to either happiness or like, or like the transferring to other emotions, that stuff. So then on less happiness, right? So they'll still feel neutral when they're not feeling sad. And it's not like you're going to be happy every single day. There are days when you're not going to feel as happy as another day. There's still stuff to look forward to. You're not always the same amount of happy. And you can still feel totally neutral, anxious, and angry. And I'd say you can go up from there. You can get more happy. Then on societal implications, they say like, you feel pain when parents die from cancer or things like that. Well, first off, you could feel other emotions to fix problems. I'd probably feel pretty angry if like the hospital let my parent die. I'd want to fix that. But then it implies that like the status quo is what we need, right? Like all our problems are going to be solved by the status quo when people can feel sadness. And I'd say the status quo isn't solving, right? It shouldn't have to take everybody's parents dying to solve all these issues. It shouldn't have to take them personally experiencing pain. People still want to do good in the world, even if bad stuff hasn't happened to them. It's not like every single invention you hear was made out of like someone's parents dying. Artwork, they have basically no impacts here. It's minimal impact. So, and they also just have no for why artwork helps the world at large, especially sad artwork. And then they say like you're missing the full range of human emotions, but I don't think you really know that if you don't feel sadness because you don't know what you're missing out on. On contention 3 of dealing with trauma, right? So like, I don't think, they say like people want to feel something when they have trauma and they don't want to feel numb. And so they transfer it into like other emotions. So first off, again, it's a contradiction. And you can't say like happiness will be less impactful because you feel fewer negative emotions, but then you also transfer it into other stuff. Like it's either going down in terms of happiness or going down in terms of other emotions. It's not just flooding everywhere. But then also, I don't think people want to necessarily feel negative emotions after bad stuff happens to them. Like if bad stuff happened to me and I had the choice to not feel sad about it, I could just feel numb. I probably would choose to feel numb, right? I wouldn't choose that I want to feel extra angry. I would just choose I want to feel numb. Also, right? Yeah, so just like on the whole, they're trying to say that you have a less net level of happiness when people are sad as well. I just think that's an inherent contradiction. And you're not going to transfer it to other emotions if that's true.
All right, phenomenal. Starting time now. There's two scenarios in this debate. I believe that many negative emotions are fueled by sadness, especially anger. That is, they said oppression makes you angry. Why? Because when you're oppressed, people are hurting you, and being hurt makes you sad, so you become angry. So anyways, for the sake of this debate, that's very confusing. There's two scenarios. Either you're experiencing numbness and happiness, or you're experiencing anger and happiness. And the reason I'm dividing these two is because both teams kind of debate functioning under both. So I'm just gonna flag why I think we're winning both and which ones are actually a distinction. So on our framing about like why do you regret it because it makes you sad, they say there's a lot of other emotions. We argue that we need these emotions like regret. We need sadness, we need empathy. Absent these, we are unable to connect as humans because we don't reflect on our actions in terms of the pain certain actions inflict on us or the people around us. They give this analysis here on top where they say, why is there as a general question going to be more happiness? And they say, because there will always be a baseline level of happiness. And this is kind of where it gets into just like everyone's going to be happy because they're not sad. Let's do like a classic utilitarian calculus of this. We're going to assume, because it's pretty uncontested, that anger is probably an emotion absent sadness in most instances. This is because in the status quo, this is how men are when they're discouraged from showing sadness, they show anger. If everybody is either angry or happy, but never sad, we essentially create this hyper-violent society. We are unaware of our oppression fundamentally because we don't experience sadness, but we experience anger and obliviousness. This means that they cannot win innovation, they cannot win climate extinction, they cannot even win this fun extinction scenario where everyone just kills each other because we don't feel sadness or empathy. All we feel is anger. So someone kills me or someone tries to kill me and I don't feel sad at all and I don't try to run away. I just try to kill them back because I don't feel the sadness. So functionally, we're just going to have a very unempathetic society. They say like you can still empathize with the other emotions people experience. However, again, what are they being empathetic towards? What are the connections that we actually form with people? They're all rooted in pain. And when we reflect our pain only through anger, all we create is just violence. That's where we have things like violent crime. They say not everyone who is angry commits violent crime. Sure, but if we have a net angrier society because people cannot experience sadness and default to anger, then we are going to have more violence. Okay. On their contention about mental health, which is probably their largest impact, this is essentially when nobody is sad, nobody is suicidal. Again, I think that this contention relies on the idea that people aren't going to experience negative emotions because suicidality can come from an overwhelming amount of any negative emotion. That is, an overwhelming amount of anger can lead someone to commit suicide, like murder suicides occur all the time. An overwhelming amount of, I don't know, like whatever. Functionally, this relies on there being no negative emotions, right? They say no negative emotions means people can recover from being in a dark place. However, absent negative emotions, that just bites our first contention that tells you that absent negative emotions, there is no happy emotions, right? Suicidality might not be an issue, but people will feel no meaning to life, right? People will feel like there is no actual meaning to their happiness, meaning people are less happy. So this small subsection of people who are like going to be suicidal is significantly smaller than the net amount of people who are going to be either like victims of violent crime, they're going to experience a worse and less empathetic humanity, etc. On their second contention about hope, they just say you can get over things quickly. One, I think anger is one of the longest emotions that takes to get over. I think people hold resentment for decades and decades. If we were going to function, I'm just going to function under anger. But if we're going to function under anger, like anger is one of the longest lasting emotions. Resentment can last decades. Also, all of the emotions they list are like byproducts of sadness, right? You're gonna bounce back from like regret. Sorry. Okay, yeah. they said that people will still acknowledge that problems happen and empathy still exists. But again, what are they being empathetic towards, right? What are they actually relating to? What are they actually empathizing with? It's really hard to empathize with violent anger. It's really hard to empathize with baseline happiness. It's really hard to empathize with like nonchalant, just complete ignorance, right? We tell you that the reason people actually care about their oppression is because it hurts them and that makes them sad and they don't want the people around them to be sad. Therefore, they fight for a better society where, you know, that anger might be that they're making them sad. That is anger towards oppressors. Anger towards oppressors is anger that comes from you being upset that you are having harm inflicted on you that makes you sad and the people around you sad. Functionally, you do create a world where you are more ignorant to your oppression, meaning that you do bite into all these impacts that Michelle states about social movements and things like that, and people actually wanting to get out of bad situations where they might be being physically harmed. Or I don't know, people don't even realize that they're being physically harmed and there's something to be sad about because they don't feel sad in the first place. They don't feel, oh, my partner punched me. I feel really sad because my partner punched me, because them punching you didn't make you sad. And I don't know, maybe it makes you mad and you punch them back, but there's nothing else there to do because all you're experiencing is this cycle of anger or numbness, either one of which is going to be worse. Next, on structural violence. I think that we're pretty cleanly winning structural violence just on the basis of the fact that people are going to be oblivious to their oppression in the app world. That is, people are going to continue to be forced under these systems that are enforcing like this structural violence that they have been experiencing for decades for the reason that that it's not making them sad. They're not feeling sad. They're not feeling angry because they have no comprehension of why they should be angry, because they have no comprehension of the degree at which they're being hurt. That is, I feel angry when I see someone oppressing someone and making them sad. If I don't have a conceptualization of that sadness and they don't have a conceptualization of that sadness, you never bridge that gap and people end up oblivious to their oppression. Extending on neg points, we talk about no more happiness. They say this is untrue because like you can go from like neutral to happiness or average happiness. Okay, sure, but you don't feel sadness. So that happiness functionally has no meaning. It's not like you are getting something that you didn't have before because the thing that you didn't have before didn't have any emotional impact on you. That is, I'm not happy to get something that I didn't have before because I wasn't sad that I didn't have it earlier. So functionally, you just end up in this cycle where you just aren't as happy as you could be, and you're also just emotionally stunted. You lack a lot of empathy. You lack the ability to connect with your pain, with the pain of the people that are surrounding you. You lack all of these human emotions that are so influential to how people act and grow. Next, on societal implications. Again, they say that you probably will feel very angry. Why will you feel very angry is the actual question that we need to ask ourselves, though. What makes people angry? Like, people form, like, okay, I care about cancer treatments because my dad passed away from cancer. I'm, I guess, angry that there wasn't a cure to cancer, but if my dad dying from cancer didn't make me sad, why would I be angry that there wasn't a cure to cancer in the first place? That's the analysis that's really missed throughout this round of just, you functionally have a connection and you fuel your anger through the sadness and understanding of human pain and emotion. Finally, on the human experience, we tell you that art is lost. They say that there isn't any impact to art being lost. I think that there is. I think human pain is one of the most like fascinating forms of art that has been studied and used in like all forms of like literature and academia throughout decades. But anyways, next on empathy, again, they say you're still gonna have empathy. However, again, you're gonna have a detachment from empathy because you're gonna be unclear about what you're empathizing with. And for all those reasons, we negate.
Okay, is everyone ready? Okay. In the MG, Ethan tells you that you can start at a baseline level of happiness. You can get more happy because people can get more happy. They can go from feeling neutral to happy. The problem is, and the part that they don't explain to you this entire round, is what happens after that. Your happiness goes up. Does it go back down? Does it stay up? Because it has to go back down according to the model they're giving you. But the problem is, what do you feel when it goes down? When your happiness goes from Disney World to neutral again, what do you feel? There's two scenarios. You either feel any other negative emotion because you went from being to Disney World to being at school, or you feel numb. They have to like advocate for one or the other because one or the other has to happen. You either feel nothing or you feel something, but either way, your happiness goes down. They tell you feel happy going to Disney. What do you feel when you get back? They have to engage with that question because it's a key of all case. Okay, first, let's say the counterfactual is anger. They do this themselves. They say if your parent dies, if you're oppressed, you're probably going to feel angry. They kind of give you this counterfactual. They kind of tell you this is true. So under this, why do we think it's really bad for the world to get a lot more angry, for all sadness to be replaced with anger, proportional anger? We say, firstly, most people who are sad aren't violent. A lot of people who are angry are very, very violent. We don't think a world in which there's more war, more violence is a good world. I think the weighing there is pretty intuitive. We think now, when you're bullied at school, instead of going home and crying about it, maybe you go and buy a gun and you perpetuate like school shootings. We think these are the kind of impacts that you see on side opposition. We think anger is a really, really unhealthy emotion that could fester in a lot of ways. We think anger makes you want to harm other people. We think often you're going to harm other people. We think there could be more war, more conflict. Millions of people can die in wars. We think it's pretty obvious why this is a bad impact for our side. And we think we can win here because we think that the possibility of war and more violence probably outweighs. This is some of the like really brutal util weighing that Fleisler was warning us about a couple days ago when running util. But we think it's probably worse for everyone, for there to be more violence symmetrically across the entire world, maybe a very small demographic of people who are so depressed that they're probably going to commit suicide. We think it's worse for the entire world to be violent, for everyone to be maybe killed, more pain. We think all of that just outweighs it there, and that's probably their biggest impact. Okay. But the second scenario is you go from Disney World, you go back from school, you don't feel anger because they also contest this link. So now you just feel nothing because you can't feel sad that your happiness went down. So now you just feel nothing. You're just now at a baseline level of happiness. Well, first of all, we don't think a numb society is a good society. We don't think you get a lot of their impacts in a numb society. Why is anyone innovating? Why is anyone trying to like speak out against structural violence? Why is anyone having hope if you're numb? We think these two things contradict each other. We don't think anyone is like actually going to feel happy when they're numb. They say happiness increases. They're probably going to collapse on that. I think happiness can increase if everyone just numb in the first place. They say our links into happiness don't make a lot of sense. I think they do, because I think that like the reason why you're able to feel more happy in general is because you acknowledge that Disneyland is one day, that you have to go to school after. You experience every moment of Disneyland, you are happy during Disneyland. We think that's like one of the key parts of human experience, that after Disneyland, you have to feel sad that it's over in order to be able to like experience the happiness in the very first place. We think when that doesn't happen and you just feel numb, then you probably go back, and then next time you go to Disneyland, it's unclear how you're actually feeling that happiness. Okay, what else are you voting up on in this debate? Firstly, on empathy, they give you this idea of like, okay, but you can empathize with other emotions, not sadness. We tell you that's not really what we mean by empathy. We think that empathizing with other people means that you acknowledge other people's pain, you acknowledge their sadness, and then you try to fix it. You say, okay, I can imagine myself in your shoes, and you're actually going to go out and try to help them. We don't think that happens because they say empathy is just like adapting to whatever emotion someone else feels. Okay, so someone else feels anger, so I now become angry for them and then commit violence for their side. That seems kind of unclear. It seems like it's probably not the impact they're going for. At the point in which they kind of have to advocate for either or, one where everyone's violent or one where everyone's numb, so proud to oppose.
Okay. There's some like weird buzzing going on outside, so I hope you can't hear that. Okay. It's gonna be a little bit interesting, but I'm just gonna be going over kind of the main voting issues of this round, then weighing. Okay. So counting begins now. So let's look at these two scenarios. Either you become numb or you transfer to the other emotions. They told us to choose one and didn't provide warranting for why either is more probable. So let's give the warranting for why numbness is the most probable. They argue for the idea that like the energy from negative things happening will transfer to other emotions like anger. However, this doesn't make sense. The emotion is arguing for getting rid of sadness. When something happens, you don't have like an inherent amount of emotional energy that is channeled through different reactions. You have different emotions expressing themselves, not an inherent reaction distributed distributing itself. Think of it like Inside Out. If sadness was gone, would Riley feel more anger or just less sadness? This means that none of their impacts of dealing with trauma happen. Or another example, look to antidepressants. Do they inherently cause you to feel more angry? Do you just go out and hurt people? No, they just kind of decrease your level of sadness. You don't become more angry when you decrease your level of sadness. You actually just become a little bit more numb. They argue that a numb society is a bad society, but number one, look for our principle of happiness and see why you should prioritize it above everything in the round, which they did not respond to. This impact comes before every single one in the round, which means as long as we uniquely access it, we win this round. And here's why we uniquely access it. The key point, the one that wins us this round, is that they didn't contest our warranting that on net there is more sadness in the world than happiness, because the average situation of one is probably not that good. For example, not everyone is going to Disneyland, but now they feel sad. Thus, it flows through that on net people are less happy than numbness. Thus, numbness is a net increase in happiness, which means that if numbness happens, it still raises average happiness because there's more sadness in the world than happiness, which has gone clean conceded. Also, happiness is still a change from the resting state. It still feels better than feeling numb. So their whole argument about like happiness being less powerful doesn't make sense. There's still a variable amount of happiness. Sure, it might decrease a little, but on net, you can still feel happy. Okay, so let's talk about this whole thing about like effects on society. Number one, on this like whole thing of innovation. Innovation goes up for us the most because people bounce back from failure, and there's this whole idea of hope because you feel less sad, you're able to get past these negative emotions quickly. And even if a marginal amount of like incentive goes away, like the whole thing if your dad dies of cancer, people will still want to innovate. And there are other incentives. What about like the anger you feel that your dad wasn't saved? What about fear of death, that you want to save other people and you don't want to die? You can still empathize with other people not wanting to die. But even if you buy this whole idea of like transferring to other emotions, number one, they provide zero warranting that it just transfers to anger. So that really mitigates all their impacts about like violent crime. It probably also transfers to like fear and anxiety. Like on this example of like someone tries to kill you, you go right back and try to kill them. Wouldn't you still feel fear? You're still going to value your life. It's not just going to be anger or violence. Also, you can't just function on anger. Resentment is just about one person. They won't want to go out and do general violent crime. So all of this impact is really mitigated. And yet again, you should look to our warranting why numbness still exists, not just like transferring to other emotions. And on this whole idea of structural violence, number one, people who are oppressed will still comprehend things like physical pain, hunger, unfairness, anger, fear, everything like that. There are still going to be all these incentives to not want to be oppressed. That can still make people passionate and angry. And additionally, empathy will still exist. It will just be based on other emotions. They kind of say like if you feel empathetic towards someone who's feeling mad, you'll feel mad, but you're not going to feel mad. You're not going to go out and kill someone because of that. You're just going to try to make the situation better. If you feel empathy for someone in today's world, you don't just start weeping and feel terrible and sad. You probably go out and try to do something about it. Okay, so let's go on to some weighing. Number one, we have higher happiness, which we've weighed a priori in the round because it is util, but better. We want to feel happy, so we don't want bad things to happen. But we also don't think it's good when you steal my shoe to give it to someone who fits it better. Why? Because of sadness. And yet again, this point that there is more sadness in the world than happiness has gone completely conceded. So we have higher happiness if you buy this numbness thing that number one, happiness will still exist. So their impact about happiness, like being less, doesn't make sense. You're not going to feel happy all the time. You're just going to feel numb. It's still going to feel good if you go to Disneyland. And you're still going to feel negative emotions. You're not just going to feel overwhelming negative emotions. And happiness still goes up on net because you're getting rid of this vast majority of sadness that we've told you about. The only other thing a priori in the round is structural violence, based off the one which we didn't extend and we won't either. At the point that it shouldn't be considered, at that point it shouldn't be considered. It should be a wash. But even so, at best, like just don't consider it's a wash. We'll say you have more hope. They'll say you have more incentive. There is like minimal weighing here. You shouldn't really consider this. So at that point, you should look to happiness, which is a principle that has gone completely conceded. We have proven that we are the only ones who actually increase happiness because there's more sadness in the world. So we urge a gov ballot.
Great round, guys.
Fantastic round, everyone.
That your definitions were to some extent abusive, just because coming off the bat, you said a few things. You said a util framework, and a lot of people forget this, but a util framework at its core, to whichever side provides the most happiness for the most amount of people. And given then that you observed that the majority of people are sad, and you are making the majority of people whom are sad more happy by bringing them to neutral, you already won just by saying that. So if you accept those definitions under a util framework, there's not much room for the op to do anything. So if you're making the majority of the world happy, because the majority of the world is sad and being brought to neutral, and because you made it a spectrum of sad, neutral, happy, and did not leave much room for other emotions such as anger and said that it was not in fact redistributed, then there's not much room, and I am almost inclined to vote Gov just because that's how the logic works. Had UP come out there and said immediately this is a tautology, we don't accept these definitions, etc., I probably would have voted UP from the very first speech. So it was really unfortunate that you guys did not say that. So on numbers, Gov kind of had to win from the beginning. Now, UP comes back and makes some really, really good refutations throughout the debate that I really liked and gave you a lot of room given where you were to begin with. For example, you say that like the peaks for the happy minority are shallower. Yeah, that's true, but they're still the minority. So numerically, you're not going to be able to win on that because the majority of people are on net sad. You also say that there's less empathy and innovation to people who are marginalized, but given that they are marginalized, that probably is the minority once again, just off definition. But even if that's not the case, sorry, you're still not going to win numerically because this only refers to a lack of happiness. Being oppressed probably means you're sad, but under util, an elimination of that sadness means you are neutral, and therefore the sadness effectively doesn't exist. So if you're eliminating that sadness and only evaluating it on happiness, not on anger or the many other side effects of being marginalized or oppressed, it doesn't mean very much to me under a util framework. So again, I can't vote there. So almost by definition, Gov won. I wish you guys had called it out as abusive, the framework specifically, or the definition of the way in which anger is not redistributed, or sadness is not redistributed. Just some other general notes. Gov, your case was kind of all built on itself. It was a bit of a prereq. Like contentions 3 and 4 were built on the fact that less sadness means more happiness, or like less sadness, or this is going to effectively lead to better lives or better quality of life. Which is only true if contentions 1 and 2 are valid. So just be careful with that in the future. And then, like I said, I think you guys did amazing. If only you had called that out. But yeah, that's all my feedback.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. Like basically a lot of what Josh said was basically on my RFD, so I won't like reiterate all of the utilitarianism stuff because I think that because of that it was pretty difficult for opposition from the start. I think that yeah, like one of the most compelling points and one of the reasons why I ended up voting for government was because of the whole idea is like, okay, even though like because the world is like net sad, like if we get rid of sadness, like the world would be happier, even if it's neutral, like it's still like relatively like better. And again, like I'm trying not to repeat things that Josh said, but I think that there was like a lot of this idea against like, oh, like this whole like this thing about like, oh, whether you're like angry or compared to like happiness. And I ultimately did buy government's reasoning as to like, you know, emotions. You don't have like a certain amount of emotions. Like once you feel sad, you start expressing that through anger. So also I gave that to side government. And I think if I say anything else, I'll just be reiterating what Josh said. So I'll leave the floor open to Zach.
Yeah, wonderful round, everyone. I actually thought it was a slightly less simple and less tautological ballot than the other two judges. I actually was convinced I was going to be voting op until the PMR. I think the PMR collapse on one of the two worlds is actually really strong and ends up being round winning. I think that on the like assuming that like anger were to be the replacement, right? I actually think op ends up winning this argument because of like the weighing I get in the LOR as to why like probably that like the mass violence that you see is going to outweigh in terms of under a utilitarian framework these ideas of whatever pain and pleasure. So I actually think that op does have ground under these definitions. The argument that's actually round winning is the argument that ends up getting collapsed on in the PMR, which is this a priori fourth argument about why upholding happiness, aka the idea of having more happiness, is going to come first. They don't gain access to that argument if they choose the other world, right? Because they're saying that instead it's just the sadness becomes anger, which means there isn't any more happiness, which means they don't gain access to the principle. So like that principle was reliant on you choosing the correct of those two worlds to collapse on and wasn't actually true for both worlds. That's why I actually thought that it wasn't necessarily right there from the definitions. So then why once those definitions, like whatever, once you chose what I think was the correct choice in the PMR, I liked the inside out example. I thought it was actually like good and relatable and helped kind of ground this idea of that, yes, it doesn't go away, but it also doesn't replace, right? Like you're able to still have an element of other emotions, but it doesn't add on to those other emotions, that there's just kind of this sort of gap. And the question is having this gap better, or is having active sadness better? And I think that the warranting that I get as to why active sadness under a utilitarian framework is worse than having a gap a priori because of the principle that you run, or is basically going to be the first place that I look. The rest of the speech doesn't really end up mattering. I end up just basically voting on like the first 45 seconds of the PMR. And then I think there's a lot of mechanistic arguments throughout both the PMR and also throughout the entire round about different arguments. But at the end of the day, I was either going to be voting up on this argument about violence, which outweighs under util, or on this just broad principle about how this absence of sadness leads to neutrality, which on net minimizes sadness under a utilitarian framework.